Welcome back to Lady Mythos. At the end of our last story, Tiamat stood surrounded by monsters. Kingu carried the tablets of destiny. The gods watched in fear, and the young god named Marduk had agreed to face the mother of creation. Most people know what happens next. They know there is a battle. They know Marduk wins. But there is one part of the story that almost nobody stops to question. If Marduk was the hero, why did he build the world from the body of the being he defeated? Why does one of humanity's oldest creation myths begin not with peace, but with war? Why does the creation of heaven and earth start with the death of a mother? And was Tiamat truly the monster that later generations claimed she was? Or was she the final victim of a universe that had already decided to replace her? Tonight, we continue one of the oldest stories ever told. A story of monsters, storms, betrayal, destiny, and a battle so immense that ancient Mesopotamians believed it shaped the very world around them. If you enjoy ancient myths and forgotten legends, consider subscribing and joining us here at Lady Mythos. There are still countless stories hidden beneath the sands of history. For now, travel back with me to a time when the heavens trembled, armies gathered beyond the cosmic sea, and two powers prepared to decide the fate of creation itself. This is the story of Tiamat and Marduk, and the battle that created the universe. Chapter 1: The Trial of the Young God. In the ancient Babylonian creation myth, the decision to send Marduk against Tiamat was not made lightly. The gods were afraid. Far more afraid than many modern retellings suggest. Beyond the boundaries of heaven, Tiamat's army continued to grow. The 11 monsters waited beside her. Kingu carried the tablets of destiny. Ancient powers were abandoning neutrality and choosing sides. And despite all their divine strength, the younger gods still faced a troubling question. What if Marduk failed? The answer was too terrible to imagine. If Tiamat won, the universe they had built could be swept away. Their authority would vanish. Their future would belong to someone else. That fear gathered the gods together in one of the most important assemblies in Mesopotamian mythology. The Divine Council. Ancient texts describe the gods gathering for a great banquet. Food was prepared. Sacred drink flowed freely. Yet beneath the celebration, anxiety lingered. This was no ordinary feast. It was a meeting to decide the fate of creation. Imagine the scene. A vast celestial hall illuminated by divine fire. Ancient gods seated upon magnificent thrones, golden vessels overflowing with drink. Whispers moving through the gathering like a restless wind. Outside, the heavens remained uneasy. Inside, every eye slowly turned toward one figure. Marduk, the young god who had volunteered to face the mother of creation. At first glance, it might seem strange that the gods hesitated. Had they not already chosen him? Had they not already placed their hopes in him? They had. But hope and certainty are not the same thing. The gods needed proof, not promises, not confidence, proof. Before Marduk could save creation, he first had to prove he could control reality itself. According to the Enuma Elish, the gods devised a test unlike any other. They placed a garment before him, a simple object, no monster, no weapon, no battlefield. Yet hidden within this challenge was a question that would determine the future of the cosmos. The gods were not asking whether Marduk could defeat a monster. They were asking something far more important. Could he control the same reality that Tiamat herself had helped create? The assembled gods issued their command. If Marduk truly possessed the power he claimed, he would make the garment disappear. Then he would restore it exactly as it had been before. The hall fell silent. Even among gods, this was no small feat. Marduk stood before the council, calm, confident, unmoved by the doubts surrounding him. Then he spoke. The ancient texts do not preserve every detail of what happened next, but they tell us the result. The garment vanished. Completely. One moment it existed. The next, it was gone. No trace remained. The gathered gods watched in astonishment. Then Marduk spoke again, and the garment returned, whole, unchanged. For a brief moment, the gathered gods witnessed something unsettling. The same power that allows a creator to bring something into existence also allows someone else to erase it, as though nothing had happened. For a moment, no one spoke. The test was over. The answer was undeniable. The young god had demonstrated authority over reality itself. Not merely strength, not merely courage, authority. The same kind of authority required to challenge someone like Tiamat. The atmosphere inside the council changed immediately. Doubt gave way to excitement. Fear gave way to hope. The gods rose from their seats. Voices filled the chamber. Praise echoed through the heavens. The young volunteer, who had entered as a candidate, was leaving as something much greater. Because this was never just a test. It was a coronation waiting to happen. The gods had found their champion. Yet there was an uncomfortable truth nobody wanted to admit. They were preparing Marduk to replace Tiamat before he had even fought her. But champions require more than confidence. They require power. And after witnessing what Marduk could do, the Divine Council made a decision that would reshape the future of heaven itself. They gave him something no god had ever possessed before. Chapter 2. The King of the Gods. The test was over. The garment had vanished. The garment had returned. And with that single demonstration, the doubts surrounding Marduk began to disappear. Yet proving his power was only the beginning. The gods had not gathered merely to find a warrior. They were searching for a ruler. Because the crisis facing creation had grown far beyond the military problem. Tiamat's rebellion was no longer simply an uprising. Kingu carried the tablets of destiny. The authority to command the cosmos itself was already being challenged. The universe could not survive with two competing centers of power. Someone would have to rule. And for the first time, many of the gods believed they had found that someone. The great hall erupted with voices. Ancient deities rose from their thrones. Praise echoed across the heavens. Marduk had entered the assembly as a promising champion. He was leaving it as something much greater. According to the Enuma Elish, the gods formally elevated him above the others. This moment is often overlooked in modern retellings. Most versions rush straight toward the battle with Tiamat. But the Babylonian storytellers considered this scene extremely important. Because before Marduk could become the hero of the myth, he first had to become king. Imagine the scene. A vast celestial chamber stretching beyond sight. Golden thrones arranged in great circles. The oldest powers in existence gathered together beneath a sky lit by divine fire. And at the center of it all stood a young god who, only moments earlier, had been one among many. The gods proclaimed his authority. His commands would carry the force of law. His voice would guide heaven itself. The battle had not started, yet the universe already had a new ruler waiting. This detail reveals something fascinating about ancient Babylonian ideology. The story was never only about monsters and battles. It was also about legitimacy, about leadership, about why one ruler deserved power more than another. The Babylonian audience listening to this myth thousands of years ago would have understood exactly what was happening. A kingdom requires a king. A universe requires a ruler. And in their eyes, Marduk was proving he deserved that role. Then came the gifts. Not ordinary gifts. Weapons. Symbols of authority. Tools meant for a conflict unlike any the cosmos had ever witnessed. The gods armed their champion. Ancient texts describe Marduk receiving a bow, arrows, a mighty mace, weapons worthy of the struggle ahead. Yet his most important powers were not forged from metal. They came from the sky. Marduk was deeply associated with storms, wind, thunder, tempests. For that reason, the gods entrusted him with forces that no ordinary warrior could wield. The four winds. The winds of heaven. Invisible powers capable of sweeping across creation itself. Some traditions describe additional winds joining his service as well, forming a terrifying arsenal of storms. Imagine dark clouds gathering above the celestial halls, ancient banners snapping in violent gusts, the air itself bending to Marduk's command. With every gift he received, the balance of power shifted a little further. The gods were placing more than weapons in his hands. The gods were placing something even more fragile than their future into Marduk's hands. Their belief that the universe still belonged to them. And perhaps most importantly, they were placing their trust there. Trust that this young ruler could face a being older than the heavens themselves. Trust that he could challenge the mother of creation. Trust that he could survive. Far beyond the halls of the gods, Tiamat continued her own preparations. Her monsters waited. Kingu stood beside her. The tablets of destiny remained in enemy hands. Two rulers now existed. Two visions of creation. Two powers claiming the right to shape the future of the cosmos. Soon, only one of them would remain. And now, only one thing stood between Marduk and absolute power. Tiamat herself. Chapter 3. The Army Waiting Beyond the Sea. While the gods celebrated their new king, another kingdom was already preparing for war. Far beyond the halls of heaven, beyond the reach of Marduk's growing authority, the ancient sea remained restless. Tiamat was waiting. And she was not waiting alone. This is the point in the story where the conflict becomes impossible to stop. There would be no final negotiations, no peace treaty, no return to the world that existed before Apsu's death. The lines had already been drawn. On one side stood the younger gods and their newly chosen champion. On the other stood the oldest force in creation itself, the mother who had once given them life. Imagine the scene, the primordial waters stretching endlessly beneath a dark and storm-filled sky. Great waves rolling across the cosmic sea, ancient powers gathering in silence. At the center of it all stood Tiamat. Not the grieving mother we left behind in part 1, not the creator who once watched generations of gods emerge from the waters. This was Tiamat transformed by loss, isolation, and purpose. The rebellion had become her reality. Around her gathered the forces she had spent ages assembling. Ancient allies, forgotten powers. Beings who believed the younger gods had inherited a universe they did not deserve. And beside her stood Kingu, the chosen champion, bearer of the tablets of destiny, the mysterious figure whose authority now challenged the very foundation of heaven. The ancient texts give us only brief glimpses of what happened during these preparations. Yet those fragments are enough to paint a remarkable picture. Kingu was no longer simply an ally. He was commanding armies, issuing orders, directing the growing coalition gathering beneath Tiamat's banner. For the first time since creation began, an organized force existed that could genuinely threaten the rule of the younger gods. And then there were the monsters, not hiding, not sleeping, waiting. The great serpents coiled through the darkness. The dragon beasts prowled the edges of the cosmic waters. The scorpion warriors stood like living fortresses. Storm creatures drifted through black clouds overhead. The army was no longer a rumor. It was real. Every report reaching heaven confirmed the same terrifying truth. Tiamat was ready. A detail often overlooked in modern retellings is how much of this conflict revolved around legitimacy rather than destruction. Tiamat was not marching blindly toward chaos. From her perspective, the younger gods had shattered the old order first. Apsu was dead. Ancient traditions had been broken. The universe had already changed beyond recognition. What followed may have looked like rebellion to some. To others, it looked like restoration. And that made the coming conflict far more dangerous, because both sides believed they were defending creation. Both sides believed they were right. Both sides believed the future depended on victory. That may be the real tragedy hidden inside the myth. Neither side believed they were becoming the villain. That is what makes this one of the oldest and most fascinating wars in mythology. It is not a battle between good and evil. It is a battle between competing visions of how the universe should exist. As the days of preparation drew to a close, strange signs began appearing throughout the cosmos. The winds shifted, the waters grew violent, the heavens felt tense. Even the younger gods sensed something approaching. The universe itself seemed to understand that a turning point was near. Then movement spread through Tiamat's ranks. Monsters advanced, allies assembled, standards rose above the dark waters. The army began to move. For the first time, creator and creation were marching toward each other. For the first time in existence, the children of creation were preparing to make war against their own mother. One carried the memory of the old world, the other carried the promise of a new one. And somewhere between them lay the fate of everything. The distance separating the two sides was shrinking. The silence before the storm was ending. Then Marduk entered the storm. Chapter 4. The challenge no god expected. The distance between the two armies continued to shrink. On one side stood the younger gods and the champion they had crowned king. On the other stood the mother of creation, the bearer of ancient grievances, and the army she had gathered from the shadows of the primordial sea. The battle felt inevitable. Yet according to the ancient Babylonian tradition, something remarkable happened before the first strike was made. Marduk approached Tiamat, not with an army at his back, not with arrows already drawn, not with the winds unleashed. He approached with words. That detail is often forgotten. When people remember the story of Tiamat and Marduk, they remember the battle, the storm, the monsters, the creation of the world. But before any of that happened, there was a confrontation unlike any other in mythology. The hero and the mother of creation stood face to face. Imagine the scene. The cosmic sea churning beneath a sky filled with black clouds. The 11 monsters watching from the darkness. Kingu standing beside Tiamat with the tablets of destiny. And emerging from the storm came Marduk, young, confident, armed with powers granted by the gods. For a moment, the armies waited. No one moved. No weapon was raised. No monster charged. Even the heavens seemed to hold their breath. The ancient text preserves fragments of what followed. Not a friendly conversation, not a negotiation, a challenge. Marduk accused Tiamat of abandoning the children she once protected. He accused her of turning against the gods she had once helped create. He questioned the rebellion she had built. The challenge was not merely military. It was moral, psychological. Marduk was forcing Tiamat to defend her choices. And that makes this scene surprisingly modern. Because beneath all the mythology, they were arguing about responsibility, about justice, about who had truly broken the order of creation. From Marduk's perspective, Tiamat had become a threat to the cosmos. She had armed monsters, empowered Kingu, threatened the stability of the universe. From Tiamat's perspective, the younger gods had murdered Apsu. To Tiamat, the accusation sounded almost absurd. The gods, speaking of justice, were the same gods who had celebrated after Apsu's death. destroyed the old balance and rewarded themselves with power afterward. The more closely you examine the story, the more complicated it becomes. Neither side sees itself as the villain. That is what makes the confrontation so compelling. Both believe they are saving creation. Both believe history is on their side. And only one can be right. Or perhaps neither is. The tension grew heavier. The armies remained frozen. The monsters watched. The gods watched. The cosmos watched. A single decision could still change everything. That is one of the most fascinating details hidden inside the myth. The battle almost began with a conversation. For one brief moment, it seemed possible that words might decide the future instead of violence. But some wounds run too deep. Some betrayals refuse to heal. And some conflicts reach a point where neither side can step back without abandoning everything they believe. Tiamat had already committed herself to war. Marduk had already accepted the burden of stopping her. The challenge had been issued. The accusations had been spoken. The final chance for peace slipped away. Then the atmosphere changed. The sea grew violent. Dark clouds twisted overhead. The heavens trembled. Something immense was approaching. Marduk tightened his grip on his weapons. Tiamat's forces shifted behind her. Across the battlefield, monsters lifted their heads toward the sky, because the time for words had ended. And from every direction at once, the winds arrived. Chapter 5. When the heavens went to war. The winds arrived first. Not Marduk, not the monsters. The winds. Across the primordial sea, the air itself began to change. The surface of the cosmic waters trembled. Clouds twisted across the heavens. Dark currents moved through the sky like living things searching for a path. Every creature in Tiamat's army felt it. Every god watching from afar felt it. The universe itself seemed to recognize that a moment unlike any other had finally arrived. Then Marduk advanced. The young king of the gods rode directly toward the heart of the storm. Ancient Babylonian texts describe him carrying powerful weapons, but it was not steel that made him terrifying. It was control. The winds obeyed him. The storm obeyed him. The sky itself bent to his command. Imagine the scene. The cosmic sea stretching beyond sight. Lightning splitting the darkness. The 11 monsters gathering around their creator. And through the center of it all moved Marduk, surrounded by violent currents of air that seemed eager for battle. Across the waters stood Tiamat, ancient, immense, the mother of creation, the being who had existed before heaven, before earth, before the first generation of gods. For a brief moment, the distance between them seemed impossible to comprehend. One represented the oldest world. The other represented the new. One carried memory. The other carried ambition. Both believed they were fighting to preserve creation. That may be the true tragedy hidden inside the myth. Neither side believed they were becoming the villain. Then the battle began. The ancient texts describe Marduk unleashing the winds he had gathered from the heavens. They rushed across the battlefield with incredible force. Not one wind, many. The 4 winds, the 7 winds. Tempests from every direction. The air screamed across the sea. Waves exploded upward, clouds shattered apart and reformed. Even Tiamat's monstrous army struggled against the violence of the storm. Then Marduk revealed another weapon, the net. One of the strangest and most overlooked details in the Enuma Elish. Modern audiences expect swords, spears, magic blasts. Instead, the Babylonian storytellers gave their champion a hunter's tool, a net. But this was no ordinary net. This was a divine trap designed to contain a primordial force. Marduk cast it outward. The winds drove it forward. The battlefield tightened around Tiamat. Every avenue of escape began to close. The monsters surged forward. Serpents twisted through the storm. Dragon-like creatures emerged from the darkness. Scorpion warriors advanced beneath crashing skies. The primordial sea erupted into chaos. Yet Marduk kept moving. Closer, closer, closer still. The distance separating creator and challenger vanished. And suddenly, the battle became personal. Ancient Babylonian texts preserve one of the most extraordinary moments in all mythology. Tiamat opened her mouth. Perhaps to unleash power, perhaps to speak, perhaps to swallow her enemy. The text does not explain every detail. What it does tell us is what happened next. Marduk was waiting. The moment her mouth opened, he unleashed the winds directly into her. The storm rushed forward. The winds filled her body. Her jaws could no longer close. The force trapped inside her continued growing. Imagine that image. The mother of creation standing against the fury of heaven itself, unable to shut out the storm, unable to contain it. The more she resisted, the more powerful the winds became. This is one of those moments where the myth feels strangely symbolic. The sea against the sky, the old world against the new, chaos against order. Or perhaps, depending on who is telling the story, order against chaos. The answer is not as simple as later generations often pretend. Around them, the battle raged. The monsters fought. The heavens shook. The waters churned. The winds screamed across creation. Yet all eyes remained fixed on 2 figures: Tiamat and Marduk. Because everyone understood something. This was no longer a fight for a kingdom. It was a fight for reality itself. If Tiamat prevailed, the future of the younger gods would end. If Marduk prevailed, the oldest power in existence would fall. Yet beneath the chaos of the battle, another question remained unanswered. If Marduk succeeded, why would the future of the universe depend on the body of the very being he was trying to destroy? The answer was still hidden beyond the storm. The fate of creation balanced on a single moment, a single decision, a single strike. Then Marduk drew his weapon. The storm fell silent. The heavens seemed to freeze. Even the monsters appeared to hesitate. Because what happened next would not simply decide a battle. It would decide the shape of the universe itself. And then came the moment that changed the universe forever. Chapter 6. The Death of a Primordial Goddess. For a brief moment, everything stood still. The winds stopped howling, the waves stopped rising. Even the monsters seemed frozen in place. The entire cosmos appeared to be waiting to see what Marduk would do. The young king of the gods stood before Tiamat. The storm remained trapped within her. The net still held. The ancient mother, who had once given birth to generations of gods, now faced the greatest challenge of her existence. And Marduk knew the moment had come. The ancient Babylonian text describes him raising his weapon and releasing the strike that would decide the fate of creation. The details vary depending on translation, but the outcome remains the same. Tiamat fell. Not slowly, not after a long struggle. The battle that had threatened the universe reached its conclusion in a single, decisive moment. The mother of creation was defeated. The primordial sea had been overcome. The oldest force in existence had finally met something stronger than itself. At least, that is how later generations would tell the story. Yet when we pause and look at the scene, it feels less like a triumph and more like the end of an age. Imagine the battlefield, the dark waters stretching beyond the horizon, the shattered storm clouds above, the monsters standing motionless. And at the center of it all lies the being who existed before heaven had a name. The being who had watched the first gods emerge from darkness. The being who had once protected the very descendants now celebrating her defeat. The oldest mother in creation had fallen. The being who had once protected the younger gods now lay defeated by the very descendants she had helped survive. And with her fall, something ancient vanished from the universe forever. Across the heavens, the younger gods erupted with relief. Fear that had haunted them for ages suddenly lifted. The threat was gone. The rebellion was broken. The future seemed secure. Ancient texts describe the gods rejoicing after Marduk's victory. To them, this was salvation. Order had survived. Creation had survived. The cosmos had survived. But not everyone on the battlefield shared that feeling. The monsters hesitated. Their creator was gone. The force that had brought them into existence had fallen silent. Some fled. Others stood frozen in disbelief. The terrifying army that had once seemed unstoppable suddenly looked lost. Without Tiamat, its purpose had disappeared. And then there was Kingu, the chosen champion, bearer of the tablets of destiny, the ally who had stood beside Tiamat throughout her rebellion. Imagine his perspective. The army shattered, the battle lost. The being who had entrusted him with cosmic authority lying defeated before him. Everything he had been chosen to protect was collapsing around him. For a brief moment, the future that Tiamat had imagined for the universe died with her. And perhaps that is what makes this story so fascinating. Because even now, thousands of years later, it is difficult to view the scene through only one lens. If you stand with Marduk, it is a heroic victory. If you stand with Tiamat, it is a tragedy. The myth refuses to become simple. That is one reason it has survived for nearly 4,000 years. Even in defeat, Tiamat remains larger than the role of a monster. She remains a creator, a mother, a force that shaped everything that came after her. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If Marduk had won, what exactly was he supposed to do next? The rebellion was over. The enemy had fallen. The gods were celebrating. Most stories would end here. The hero wins, the monster loses, the world is saved. But the Enuma Elish does something far stranger, something few first-time listeners expect. Because Marduk did not look upon Tiamat's defeat and walk away. He looked upon the body of the primordial mother, and he saw possibility. The battle for creation was finished, yet the creation of the world had not even begun. Because Marduk was about to do something no one expected. Chapter 7. The World Made from a Goddess. Most creation myths begin with a creator, a command, a spark, a divine act that brings order out of nothing. But the ancient Babylonian storytellers imagined something very different. In their version of creation, the world was not made from nothing. It was made from someone. That is what makes this story so strange and so unforgettable. The battle was over. Tiamat had fallen. The monsters were defeated. The younger gods celebrated. Yet Marduk did not leave the battlefield. He remained beside the vast body of the primordial mother, looking, thinking, planning. According to the Enuma Elish, Marduk gazed upon Tiamat and conceived an idea. Not another battle, not another punishment, a new creation. Imagine the scene, the storm beginning to fade, the cosmic sea slowly calming, the gods watching from a distance. And stretched across the waters lay the being who had existed before heaven, before earth, before the first generation of gods. The mother of creation, the sea itself. Then Marduk did something that would define Babylonian mythology forever. He transformed her defeat into the foundation of a new universe. The ancient text describes him dividing Tiamat into two parts, not out of cruelty, not out of rage, but out of purpose. One half would become the heavens, the other half would become the earth below. Pause for a moment and think about how extraordinary that idea is. The sky above, the ground beneath, the structure of the cosmos itself, all of it emerging from the body of the same being the gods had feared only moments earlier. Suddenly, the question from the beginning of our story feels much more complicated. If Tiamat was merely a monster, why would creation be built from her? Why would the world itself come from her? The myth seems to suggest something deeper. Tiamat was not erased. She was transformed. The ancient mother became part of everything. According to the Babylonian account, Marduk stretched one portion upward to form the heavens. He fixed it in place, established boundaries, created structure where chaos had once reigned. The sky was no longer an endless expanse. It had shape, purpose, order. Then he arranged the world below. The cosmos began to take on the form familiar to later generations. This is one of the reasons the Enuma Elish was so important to Babylonian culture. It was not simply explaining where the gods came from. It was explaining why the universe looked the way it did. Why there was a sky. Why there was an earth. Why boundaries existed between different realms of creation. And Marduk was not finished. The ancient texts describe him organizing the cosmos with remarkable precision. He established stations for the gods, assigned responsibilities, created structure where uncertainty once existed. Many modern retellings rush through this section, yet for the Babylonians, this was the true victory. The battle mattered, but the creation that followed mattered even more. Defeating Tiamat proved Marduk's strength. Building a functioning universe proved his right to rule. And there is another fascinating detail hidden within the story. The waters never disappear. Even after Tiamat's defeat, traces of the primordial sea remain woven into creation. Some scholars see this as a reminder that chaos was never fully destroyed. It was contained, organized, given boundaries, but it remained part of the world. Perhaps that idea still feels familiar today. The ocean remains powerful. Storms remain powerful. Nature remains powerful. Humanity builds walls, cities, and kingdoms, yet the ancient forces beneath the surface never truly vanish. In a strange way, Tiamat survives through all of them. The more Marduk shaped the cosmos, the stranger the story became. Because this was not a universe created by a distant creator speaking words into the darkness. This was a universe built from memory, built from conflict, built from sacrifice, built from the remains of the being who had once stood at the beginning of everything. The universe was not created from nothing. It was created from someone. Every mountain, every river, every star above the ancient world existed because one primordial being no longer did. And that revelation changes the entire story. The battle that seemed like an ending was actually the beginning. The world had been shaped. The heavens had been established. Order had replaced uncertainty. Marduk stood victorious. Yet one final problem remained. A problem that neither the monsters nor Tiamat herself had been able to solve. Who would serve this newly ordered world? Chapter 8. The Fate of Kingu. The war was over. Tiamat had fallen. The monsters were scattered. The heavens belonged to Marduk. Yet one figure remained at the center of the crisis. Kingu, the god who had stood beside Tiamat when much of creation turned against her. The god who had accepted the tablets of destiny. The god who, for a brief moment, had been presented as the future ruler of the cosmos. And unlike Tiamat, Kingu was still alive, at least for now. As order returned to the universe, the victors began gathering the remnants of the rebellion. The monsters that had terrified heaven were defeated. The allies who had followed Tiamat were subdued. One by one, the supporters of the ancient mother were brought before the new rulers of creation. Among them stood Kingu. Imagine the scene. The storm has finally passed. The heavens are quiet again. The younger gods stand assembled beneath the new order established by Marduk, and before them stands the former champion of Tiamat. Not surrounded by armies, not protected by monsters, alone. For someone who had once carried the future of creation in his hands, it was a remarkable fall. Because Kingu had possessed something no other follower of Tiamat possessed: the tablets of destiny. The very object that had transformed a rebellion into a challenge for universal authority. The tablets had made him more than a commander, more than an ally. They had made him a rival to the gods themselves. Whoever held them possessed the right to command, the right to establish order, the right to rule. Or at least, that was the belief woven into Mesopotamian mythology. Now that authority was about to be stripped away. According to the Enuma Elish, the gods seized the tablets of destiny from Kingu. The transfer is described briefly in the surviving text. Yet its importance cannot be overstated. This was not simply the loss of a powerful artifact. It was the loss of legitimacy, the loss of purpose, the loss of the future Tiamat had imagined for him. One moment, he carried destiny itself. The next, destiny belonged to someone else. Few figures in mythology rise so high and fall so completely in such a short span of time. There is something strangely tragic about that image. Because unlike Marduk, Kingu never fought his way to power. Unlike Ea, he never outwitted his enemies. Unlike Tiamat, he never created monsters or commanded primordial forces. The authority he possessed had been given to him, bestowed upon him by someone who believed in him. And now the source of that belief was gone. The ancient mother had fallen. The rebellion had collapsed. And Kingu stood alone before the judgment of the victorious gods. Some scholars have long debated how ancient audiences viewed Kingu. Was he an ambitious usurper, a loyal supporter, a symbolic stand-in for defeated kings? The text offers surprisingly few answers. Much of his personality remains hidden behind 4,000 years of history. Yet, perhaps that mystery is what makes him memorable. He appears suddenly, rises unexpectedly, touches absolute power, then loses everything. It is one of the oldest rise and fall stories in mythology. The gods examined his role in the rebellion. They considered the authority he had wielded, and ultimately, judgment was passed. The burden of responsibility would fall upon him. The rebellion needed a culprit. Someone would answer for what had happened. And Kingu became that figure. The bearer of destiny was now the bearer of blame. His authority vanished. His status vanished. even his future, vanished. Kingu had once carried destiny itself. Now destiny was about to abandon him. Yet what happened next is where the story becomes truly unexpected. Because the gods were not finished with Kingu, not even close. His role in the myth was far from over. In fact, the most important thing he would ever contribute to creation had not happened yet. And strangely enough, it would come only after he had lost everything. Because from Kingu's downfall, the Babylonians believed something entirely new was about to emerge. Something that still exists today. Something called humanity. Chapter 9. Why humans were created. Most creation myths ask a simple question. Where did humanity come from? The Enuma Elish asks a different one. Why were humans created at all? And the answer is far stranger than most people expect. By the time Kingu's fate was decided, the war was over. Tiamat had fallen. The monsters were gone. The tablets of destiny had been recovered. Marduk ruled the heavens. Order had replaced chaos. At least on the surface. Yet one final problem remained. The universe still required work. That may sound like an unusual concern after a cosmic war, but it was an important part of how the ancient Mesopotamians understood the world. The gods were powerful. They governed rivers, storms, stars, seasons, and the countless forces that shaped existence. But maintaining that order demanded effort. Temples had to be supplied. Offerings had to be made. The machinery of creation needed constant attention. In Mesopotamian thought, divine order was not something that simply maintained itself forever. Someone had to support it. Someone had to carry the burden. And the gods were tired. This idea appears in several Mesopotamian traditions. Even before the Enuma Elish was written, older myths describe divine beings growing weary of endless labor. The universe existed. The heavens existed. The earth existed. But who would maintain them? Who would perform the work required to sustain the new order Marduk had created? The answer would become one of the most important decisions in mythology. According to the ancient story, Marduk gathered the gods and proposed a solution. A new kind of being. Not another god, not another monster. Something entirely different. A servant race. A race capable of working, building, maintaining temples, and carrying responsibilities that the gods no longer wished to bear themselves. According to the myth, humans were not created to rule the earth. They were created to work for the gods. To modern listeners, that idea can sound harsh. Yet, to the ancient Mesopotamians, it explained something they saw every day. Life was difficult. Fields had to be worked. Cities had to be maintained. Survival itself felt like labor. Many creation stories place humanity at the center of existence. The Enuma Elish does almost the opposite. Humans are introduced as helpers, caretakers, laborers within a much larger cosmic system. Yet the method of creation is what makes this part of the story unforgettable. Because Marduk needed more than clay, more than earth, more than simple matter. He wanted humanity to possess something of divine origin, something that connected them to the events that had shaped the universe. And that brings us back to Kingu, the former bearer of the Tablets of Destiny, the champion of Tiamat, the god who had stood on the losing side of history. The ancient text tells us that Kingu was chosen as the source from which humanity would be created. His punishment became part of creation itself. According to the Enuma Elish, Kingu was sacrificed, and from his blood, humanity was formed. It is one of the oldest and most striking creation scenes ever recorded. Imagine the symbolism. The rebellion is over. The last traces of the old conflict are being gathered. And from the blood of the defeated champion emerges an entirely new form of life. Humanity enters the story carrying a strange inheritance. Part mortal, part divine. Born from the aftermath of a war that existed before the first human ever opened their eyes. This detail fascinated scholars for generations because it suggests something deeply interesting about how the Babylonians viewed human nature. Humans were not created from perfection. They were created from conflict, from rebellion, from divine history itself. Perhaps that is why people possess both wisdom and flaws, both creativity and destruction, both order and chaos. The blood of a defeated god flowed through the foundation of humanity. Whether ancient audiences interpreted the story that way is impossible to know. But it remains one of the most thought-provoking moments in Mesopotamian mythology. And once humanity existed, the purpose became clear. People would build temples. People would make offerings. People would perform the labor that allowed the gods to focus on governing the cosmos. The burden shifted. The responsibilities changed hands. The universe finally had caretakers. For the gods, this was a solution. For humanity, it was a beginning. And for Marduk, it was the final piece of a much larger plan. The young god who had challenged Tiamat, the warrior who had defeated chaos, the ruler who had reshaped the cosmos. He now possessed something even greater than victory. A functioning world. A world with order. A world with purpose. A world with inhabitants. The war that began in the primordial waters had finally produced something entirely new. Us. And with humanity's arrival, Marduk's victory was finally complete. Or at least, it seemed complete. Because one final chapter remained. One final question lingered over everything that had happened. What did all of this mean? Why did one of humanity's oldest myths insist that the world began with conflict, sacrifice, and transformation? And why has the story of Tiamat and Marduk survived for nearly 4,000 years, when so many others have vanished into silence? Chapter 10. Babylon's Greatest Myth. By the end of the Enuma Elish, the universe had been transformed. Tiamat was gone, Kingu was gone, humanity had been created, the heavens had been organized, the earth had been established, and Marduk sat at the center of it all. For many stories, that would be the ending. But for the people of ancient Babylon, this was where the story truly began. Because the Enuma Elish was never just a tale about gods. It was a story about power, a story about authority, a story about who deserved to rule the world. And that made it one of the most important myths ever written. Imagine yourself standing in Babylon nearly 3,000 years ago. The city is enormous. Its walls stretch across the horizon. Temples rise above crowded streets. Merchants, priests, travelers, and kings move through one of the greatest cities on earth. And towering above them all stands the great temple dedicated to Marduk. To the Babylonians, Marduk was not simply a character in an old story. He was their god, their protector, the divine ruler who had defeated chaos and created order. The hero who made civilization possible. Every year, that belief came alive during one of Babylon's most important celebrations. The Akitu Festival, the Babylonian New Year. For days, ceremonies filled the city. Processions moved through the streets. Priests carried sacred statues. Crowds gathered to witness rituals that connected heaven and earth. And at the center of those ceremonies stood the Enuma Elish. The story was publicly recited. Not quietly, not hidden away in libraries. Read aloud for everyone to hear. Generation after generation, year after year. Imagine listening to the story as a Babylonian citizen. You hear how chaos threatened existence. You hear how the gods feared Tiamat. You hear how Marduk stepped forward when no one else would. You hear how he defeated the forces of disorder and created the world itself. And then you step outside and look around. At Babylon, at its king, at its temples, at its wealth. The message becomes difficult to miss. Just as Marduk brought order to the cosmos, Babylon claimed to bring order to the world. The myth reinforced the city, and the city reinforced the myth. That connection helps explain why Marduk became so important. Earlier Mesopotamian cities often placed other gods at the center of their religious life. But as Babylon rose to power, Marduk rose with it. His influence expanded alongside the empire itself. In many ways, the Enuma Elish reflects that transformation. Some scholars believe the story helped elevate Marduk above older gods by placing him at the center of creation. The young champion becomes king of the gods. The city of Babylon becomes the center of the world. Mythology and politics begin moving together. That does not make the story less meaningful. If anything, it makes it more fascinating, because it reveals how myths shape civilizations, and how civilizations shape myths. The story was no longer just mythology. It had become power. A king ruling Babylon could point to Marduk's victory as proof that order was meant to triumph over chaos. Priests could point to the same story to explain why the gods deserved worship. Citizens could hear it and understand their place within the larger cosmic order. The myth worked on every level at once: religion, politics, identity, history. And perhaps that is one reason it survived when so many other stories vanished. It was never merely entertainment. It helped explain how the world worked. Yet time has a strange effect on old stories. Because thousands of years later, people began reading the Enuma Elish differently. They started asking questions ancient audiences may never have considered. Questions about Tiamat. Questions about Marduk. Questions about who was telling the story. And those questions would eventually transform the way many people understood the myth itself. The battle was over. The world had been created. Marduk had won. But the deeper mystery of the story was only beginning to emerge. Epilogue. Did Tiamat lose the war? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Of course Tiamat lost. Marduk defeated her. Her armies were destroyed. Her champion fell. The tablets of destiny were taken. The world itself was built upon her defeat. If we stopped the story there, the conclusion would seem unavoidable. The hero won, the monster lost. The end. But myths have a habit of becoming more complicated the longer we sit with them. And few myths become more complicated than this one. Because thousands of years after the Enuma Elish was first written, people are still talking about Tiamat, still debating her, still questioning what she represents. And that raises an interesting possibility. What if defeat is not the same thing as disappearance? Think about what actually happened. Marduk won the battle. No ancient Babylonian would have questioned that. The Enuma Elish celebrates his victory from beginning to end. He defeats chaos. He establishes order. He creates the world. He becomes king of the gods. Everything about the story points toward Marduk's triumph. Yet, there is a detail hiding in plain sight. The world Marduk creates comes from Tiamat. The heavens come from Tiamat. The earth comes from Tiamat. The structure of the cosmos itself emerges from Tiamat. Even in defeat, she remains part of everything. The universe is built from her. Without Tiamat, there is no victory. Without Tiamat, there is no world. Without Tiamat, there is no story. And that is where modern readers often begin seeing the myth differently. Many scholars place the Enuma Elish within a much older storytelling pattern, sometimes called the Chaos Kampf, the struggle between order and chaos. A younger champion rises. An ancient force stands against them. A great battle follows. Order wins. Chaos loses. Versions of this pattern appear again and again throughout world mythology. We find echoes of it in Greek myths, in Norse myths, in Near Eastern myths. Again and again, civilization defines itself by overcoming something older, something wilder, something harder to control. The Enuma Elish may be one of the oldest surviving examples. But modern audiences often notice something ancient listeners may not have focused on. Chaos is rarely completely destroyed. It never truly vanishes. It remains beneath the surface. waiting. The sea is a perfect example. For the Babylonians, the sea represented uncertainty, danger, the unknown, a force no king could fully control. And what was Tiamat? The sea itself. Not merely a goddess connected to water, the primordial waters, the vast and untamed deep that existed before cities, kingdoms, temples, and laws. Marduk creates civilization. Tiamat represents what existed before civilization. That tension still feels familiar today. Even now, human beings build walls against rivers, construct cities in deserts, attempt to control forests, storms, and oceans. Sometimes we succeed. Sometimes nature reminds us who was here first. Perhaps that is one reason Tiamat continues to resonate with modern audiences. Many people no longer see her only as a monster. They see something older, something more complicated, a force that cannot be reduced to a simple villain. In recent decades, some readers have even interpreted Tiamat through environmental themes, not because the ancient Babylonians intended it that way, but because myths evolve alongside the people who read them. To these modern interpretations, Tiamat can represent the natural world itself, powerful, creative, dangerous, essential. A force that civilization depends upon, even as it attempts to control it. Others focus on another aspect of the story, the fact that Tiamat is one of the great primordial mothers of mythology. Before she became an enemy, before she became a dragon, before she became chaos, she was a creator, a source of life, the mother of generations of gods. And that image has remained surprisingly powerful, especially in an age where audiences increasingly look beyond simple heroes and villains. People often sympathize with Tiamat today because they know her full story. They remember Apsu, they remember the grief, they remember the betrayal, they remember the loss. Ancient Babylon celebrated Marduk. Modern audiences often understand Tiamat. Neither perspective is necessarily wrong. They are simply looking at the same story from different sides. And perhaps that brings us back to one of the oldest truths about mythology. The winners usually tell the story. Babylon became powerful. Marduk became Babylon's champion. The Enuma Elish survived. The version of events that reached us was the version preserved by those who ruled. That does not mean the story is false. It means it has a perspective, like every story ever told. And maybe that is why Tiamat refuses to disappear, because every generation finds something different in her. A monster, a mother, nature, chaos, creation, loss, memory. A reminder that order and disorder are often connected more closely than we would like to admit. After all, Marduk did not create the world from nothing. He created it from what came before. Creation required destruction. Order required chaos. The future required the past. And perhaps that was the deeper mystery hiding inside the myth all along. Not whether Marduk was right, not whether Tiamat was wrong, but whether either could exist without the other. Before heaven had a name, there was only water. From those waters came gods. From those gods came war. From that war came the world. Kingdoms rose, empires fell. Babylon itself vanished into history. Its temples crumbled. Its kings disappeared. Its armies became dust. The gods who defeated her are gone. The empire that celebrated Marduk is gone. Yet the sea remains. The same vast waters that inspired some of humanity's oldest stories still stretch beyond the horizon. Still powerful. Still mysterious. Still impossible to fully control. And perhaps that is why Tiamat never truly disappeared. After hearing both parts of the story, I have one question for you. Did Tiamat lose the war? Or did she become the world? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you'd like to explore more forgotten myths, ancient gods, and legendary stories from around the world, don't forget to subscribe to Lady Mythos. Until next time, thank you for listening. Yours, Lady Mythos.